So we conducted this research project on video game culture. We interviewed a couple students and a professor to see what people felt about video games and if there's any scholarly significance. So Zach, let's talk about your interview. That was conducted over a different kind of medium.
Yes, I have multiple friends who I only know from online. One of them I interviewed is a casual gamer, and she has fallen victim repeatedly to the stereotype that all gamers are hardcore gamers.
Yeah, and I actually thought, because I interviewed people because I thought they were actually hardcore gamers, and it turned out to be that they are very casual.
And we have some clips from your interviews. Let's check those out.
What kind of games do you play?
All kinds that pique my interest. Mostly heavily story-based games.
What are your opinions of video games as a social medium?
It's not a place to talk about your feelings, that's for sure. So, yeah, you're just gonna get bullied there. I mean, it's a good way to communicate, but meet new people.
So what platform do you use to play video games?
I usually play on PlayStation. I played a lot of Xbox up here because that's pretty much all everybody has, but for the most part, PlayStation.
How do video games affect your daily life now?
Now, well, in college, I really don't play that often, but when I go home, I do play a good percentage.
Do you usually play with people when you play multiplayer games online or with like actual people like that?
It depends. Sometimes I'll play with people that are in the room if I have friends over, but a majority of the time I do play online because that's the easiest way to play with a lot of my friends because we're not in the same place.
All right, so those were the students we interviewed here at Penn State. We also interviewed Professor Bruciatelli here. He is a professor of American Studies. He also teaches a class specifically geared towards digital America, which is why he was a good person to talk to about video games here. We talked to him about impact on society and generations, some folklore and video games and social media, a whole bunch of other things. So let's cut to that interview.
I think video games have quite a significant impact that's ongoing and that we don't understand terribly well yet because for some reason there has been a little bit of a lag in terms of the way that scholars have been looking at video games. And this is comparable in some ways to the emergence of film studies earlier on, but you know, one thing that is not always taken note of is that the video game industry for many years now has been as big or bigger than the Hollywood film industry in terms of, you know, monetary revenues generated and so forth, and so arguably is having as significant an impact as Hollywood culture is on American culture and global culture more generally. Because video games are artistic texts, you know, you routinely find them engaging with topics in American history, for example, right? And so telling stories about different aspects of American history and American life. So, for example, games like Red Dead Redemption deal with the Wild West, right? The Western U.S. In a frontier perspective, and they do that, but they do that in a very specific kind of way, right? And certainly, there's a multitude of games that deal with you know, the historical experience of World War I, World War II, the Revolutionary War. You think of things like Assassin's Creed and so forth. Well, video games, I would say, have arguably been social media for quite a long time. You know, we see the emergence of things like MUDs and mushes. I don't know if have you ever encountered the terms MUD or mush. So MUD stood for multi-user dungeon. And MUSH, I actually forget what the abbreviation MUSH stood for, but these were multiplayer online games that that go back as far as even textual interface games. So the earliest MUD games oftentimes were text-based games. I haven't seen any studies that I think of as conclusive that link together violent behavior and video games explicitly. And more to the point, I think that you see, again, to go back to the first point, that video games and video game culture is so pervasive in American society that it would be difficult to argue that everyone that played video games, or even everyone that played video games with some violent component, which is many video games, was more prone to violent action. That simply doesn't seem like a claim that would hold much water given the scope of what we're talking about in terms of this phenomenon. Well, I think they'll play a very significant role in everyday, the everyday experience of art and culture, right? I mean, as essentially interactive artistic texts, and also spaces for communalization, a socialization and cultural performance. I think video games are among other digital spaces, are going to become really, really key centers for American social and cultural life. Absolutely. In the last 10 years, there has been the coming together of video game studies, which has emerged and I think is taken more seriously now even than it was 5 years ago, right? And so there's been a number of really great studies that have come out since, let's say, 2007 or so. We did see the emergence of a virtual world that was proposing exactly what you're talking about, and this was Second Life, which was, if you're not familiar with this, was not exactly a video game in the sense that it had no objective. It was a virtual world that, had many of the aesthetic features that we would recognize as a kind of virtual world, massive multiplayer game. But there was nothing to do other than go in there, right? And one of the things that people talked about a lot, especially in sort of popular media surrounding Second Life early on, was the idea that Second Life would become a space where you could, go online and socialize with people, but you could and meet new people, but you could also attend lectures, or you could attend cultural events, or you could do this and that, of the kind of things that you were talking about. Interestingly, and I just found this out the other day, Penn State Harrisburg actually has a presence in Second Life. We have a hacienda in Second Life, which I think was established there perhaps for teaching Spanish. So we do have, and that was Professor Clark that was responsible for that. So there was, this was an example of exactly what you're kind of getting at, and there was early on some high-profile figures that created Second Life avatars and were doing things like lecturing. I think Kurt Vonnegut may have given a lecture in Second Life at one point, something like that. So there were people that were doing stuff like that. And the thought was that this would be the wave of the future. Well, now, a few years later, Second Life has not been as successful as people were thinking it would be. And so I think that suggests that a total immersion in virtual reality is, at least at this point, not as attractive as a story like that would make it seem.
Okay, so that was Professor Bruciatelli, or Dr. Bruciatelli, giving his pretty interesting stuff there. Now we also looked at a couple scholarly sources. Zach, what did you find in your research?
My first source is called Gaming History, Computer and Video Games as Historical Scholarship by Don Spring. It talks about how video games could be used to teach students about history better than any other medium, and how it could be done by immersing them in a historical event and getting them involved in it. My second source is Influence of Video Games on Executive Functions in College Students by Buello, Okeddy, and Cooper. It talks about how video games can help cognition and executive functions, and how both men and women could benefit equally from video games.
Alright, awesome. And Sam?
My source I have is from Arthur Berger, Video Games, a Popular Culture. He talked about how video games can lead to physical problems such as obesity, depression, and alienation. And then he also talked about some other things, typical issues that are coming from video games, such as violence and sexuality in the video games. But my second source by Gary Crawford, Video Games, I found it really interesting because he answered the question of who plays video games. And you typically think the person who plays video games is an introverted person. However, he argued that to define who plays video games, you have to look at how they play video games. So you have the explorer investigator who wants to do quests, social climbers who want to become known in the video games, and also the nurturers who want to take care of their avatars. So it's not based on personality types, it's how you play.
Alright, my sources include half-real video games between real roles and fictional worlds. This source is by Jesper Jewell. He actually conducted a study with 42 young men and 3 brave young women and talked about video game culture and looked at it as an interactive medium and social force. My second source was it was by Leonardo as a categorization of new classes of digital interaction. It introduces the concept of digital interactivity and looking at video game culture as it is employed in that interactivity. Yeah, this source was just great to see it categorized and it's a new concept. So that's everything, our interviews, our research, and
Pretty interesting findings.
yeah, video games, our culture, I would say.
Yeah.
That,
Our generation.
yeah, they have their own text. It's fun, and they tell stories like movies and cinema almost.
Yeah, and we hope that this will help you think of video games in a new light instead of just a material that corrupts younger people. It is actually a new type of medium that can help define the future.